Arthur Hayes spent 28 years as a Navy aviation mechanic aboard the USS Constellation. He never sought glory, but one day when he arrived at Naval Station Norfolk for the ship's decommissioning ceremony, a Navy officer turned him away, mocked him, humiliated him in front of a crowd. But when a Master Chief recognized his name, everything changed in a way that no one expected. Before we dive in, tell us in comments where in the world are you watching from. Dawn broke gray over Naval Station Norfolk, cold light spilling across empty concrete. Arthur Hayes stood at the security checkpoint, 68 years old and holding a toolbox that had crossed more oceans than most men ever see. His hands, scarred from decades of engine work, trembled slightly as he offered his faded veteran ID to the guard. Derek Lawson barely glanced at it. 24 muscular clipboard in hand like a weapon, he smirked. This isn't a nursing home field trip, old man. Move along. Arthur's voice stayed steady. I'm here for the Constellation ceremony. I served on her for expired credentials. No entry. Derek keyed his radio. Need backup at gate 3. Got a situation. Something flickered in Arthur's eyes. Pain. A lifetime of service reduced to a situation. He swallowed it down, straightened shoulders that had carried jet engines. Sailors walked past, dress whites crisp in the morning air. They saw, they kept walking. Derek stepped closer. Leave. Now, or I'll have you removed. Arthur looked past him toward the ship waiting in the distance. Home. Just once more. Arthur turned away from the gate, toolbox hanging heavy at his side. The walk back to his truck felt longer than any deployment ever had. He shouldn't have expected different. Men like him had always been invisible. 6 hours earlier, his alarm had sounded in the darkness of a studio apartment that smelled faintly of motor oil and old coffee. The walls told the story security guards never bothered to read. Black and white photographs in mismatched frames. A folded flag in a shadow box. Technical manuals from the 70s and 80s, spines cracked from constant reference. A USS Constellation mug sat beside the coffee maker. Its Navy insignia faded from 10,000 mornings. Arthur had ironed his only suit with the same precision he'd once used calibrating aircraft instruments. He'd opened the drawer beside his bed and removed a single medal, polishing it with a cloth until it caught the bathroom light. 28 years of service. Most of them aboard the Constellation, down in the machinery spaces and flight deck, where the real work happened while officers took salutes and pilots got their wings. Painted on fighter jets, he'd been the man in grease-stained coveralls who made sure those pilots came home. His wife Sarah had understood. Before the cancer took her during his 3rd deployment, she'd told their kids, "Daddy keeps the planes flying. He's the reason everyone else gets to be heroes." He'd raised those kids alone after that, attending their school plays between maintenance rotations, teaching them that service meant showing up without expecting applause. He'd attended every retirement ceremony for officers he'd served under. Always sat in the back row. Never spoke. Never needed to. Today was supposed to be different. Today was his goodbye. The Constellation was being decommissioned, and someone in the Navy had remembered his name long enough to send an invitation. He'd lost the paper copy somewhere between the apartment and his truck. Now it didn't matter. Arthur set the toolbox in his passenger seat and stared at the gate one last time. Arthur's hand was on the door handle when Derek's voice cut across the parking lot. "Sir, stay right there." He turned. A second man approached the checkpoint, older than Derek but carrying the same swagger. Phil Martinez, supervisor, according to the badge clipped to his polo shirt. Contract security. The kind of authority that came from a clipboard, not experience. Arthur walked back slowly. Maybe someone had checked. Maybe common sense had prevailed. Phil crossed his arms. "Derek says you're trying to access a restricted vessel with expired credentials." "I have an invitation," Arthur said quietly. "From the decommissioning committee." "Official Navy correspondence," Derek smirked. "Yeah?" "Let's see it." Arthur reached for his phone. The flip model. 5 years old, that his daughter kept threatening to replace. His thick fingers fumbled with the buttons. It's in my email. I lost the printed copy, but I can... Sure you did, Pops. Phil and Derek exchanged a look that said everything. Another old man. Another story. A crowd was forming. Junior sailors heading to morning muster. Dock workers starting their shifts. Someone held up a phone recording. Arthur's face burned, but he kept his voice level. I have proof. In my toolbox. My old credentials, certifications, photographs. Let me see. Derek reached for the box before Arthur could react, grabbing it with both hands. The latch, worn smooth from decades of use, gave way instantly. Tools scattered across the concrete. Wrenches, calipers, technical diagrams in plastic sleeves, photographs spinning like leaves, faces and aircraft bleeding into the gray morning. Could be stolen, Derek said, nudging a wrench with his boot. Could be fake. Arthur's hands trembled. Not fear, something deeper, something that came from watching your life treated like garbage. He knelt slowly, knees popping like gunshots in the silence, and began gathering pieces of himself from the cold ground. A photograph landed face up near his hand. Young Arthur, barely 25, standing beside an F-14 Tomcat, arms slung around a pilot's shoulders, both men grinning like they owned the sky. The photo was creased down the middle from being carried in a wallet for 40 years. No one looked at it. No one recognized what it meant. Derek stepped closer, voice soaked in contempt. Listen, I don't know what you think you did, but this is a secure facility. You're not getting on that ship. Now leave before I have you arrested for trespassing. Arthur stood, tools clutched against his chest. His shoulders straightened despite everything. Despite the audience and the phones and the humiliation burning through his ribcage. I just wanted to say goodbye. His voice barely carried. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable. Someone whispered, maybe we should check his story. But feet stayed planted, eyes looked away. Arthur turned toward his truck. This time he didn't look back. Master Chief Petty Officer Frank Kowalski had seen enough Navy mornings to recognize trouble from 100 yards away. He was 60, gray-bearded, carrying a box of ceremony programs toward the Constellation when he noticed the crowd at the checkpoint. 35 years in the Navy had taught him that crowds meant either someone had done something heroic or someone had done something stupid. Security guards standing over scattered tools usually meant the latter. Frank set down his box and walked closer. Derek and Phil were already dispersing the onlookers, kicking aside debris like it was trash. Frank knelt and picked up a photograph that had landed near the curb. He froze. Young kid in coveralls, F-14 Tomcat, pilot with his arm around the mechanic's shoulder. Frank knew that aircraft. He knew that pilot. Commander James Reaper Sullivan, killed in a training accident in 1987. Frank had been at the funeral, but the mechanic... Frank looked up sharply. An old man was walking away across the parking lot, shoulders hunched, toolbox hanging from one hand like an anchor. Something about the posture, the way he carried himself despite everything. Wait, is that... Frank moved fast for a man his age, intercepting Derek before he could leave. Who was that man? Where did he go? Derek barely glanced up from his clipboard. Some old guy trying to con his way onto the ship with fake credentials. Happens all the time. What was his name? Derek sighed, annoyed at the interruption. Arthur Hayes? Something like that. Look, Chief, we handled it. He's leaving. Frank went pale. The photograph trembled in his hand. He pulled out his phone, fingers suddenly clumsy. The call connected after one ring. Captain, we have a situation. His voice cracked. Arthur Hayes was just turned away at security. A pause. Then Captain Elena Rodriguez's voice, sharp with confusion. Who? Arthur Hayes, ma'am. Frank swallowed hard. Yes, that Arthur Hayes. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. Then her voice came back, no longer a question but a command. Find him, now. And get the crew on deck. Across the parking lot, Arthur reached his ancient pickup truck. He placed the toolbox in the bed with the gentleness of a man handling something sacred. His hand lingered on the worn metal, fingers tracing scratches that held 40 years of stories. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and climbed into the driver's seat. Frank ran. 60 years old, 35 years of service, and he ran like his life depended on catching that truck before it left the parking lot. Other sailors saw him sprinting and followed without knowing why. Instinct. When a master chief runs, you run. Mr. Hayes. Sir, please wait. Arthur's hand froze on the door handle. He turned slowly, confusion written across weathered features. Frank reached him breathless, chest heaving, and did something Arthur hadn't seen in decades. He saluted. Perfect form. Fingers to brow, eyes locked, respect carved into every line of his body. Sir, on behalf of the United States Navy, I apologize. Arthur blinked. I'm not an officer. I was just a mechanic, Frank's voice cracked. Sir, you're a legend. Behind Frank, more sailors appeared. Dozens pouring from the gate, then more from the ship itself. Word was spreading like wildfire through passageways and berthing compartments, whispered over radios and shouted down ladders. Arthur Hayes is here. The Guardian is here. The ship's 1MC crackled to life, Captain Elena Rodriguez's voice echoing across the entire vessel and out over the water. All hands. This is the captain. Arthur Hayes is on the dock. Man the rails. Full honors. What happened next would be remembered by every sailor present for the rest of their lives. 400 crew members in dress whites emerged onto the deck of the USS Constellation in perfect formation. They lined the rails from bow to stern, a river of white uniforms against gray steel. As one, they turned toward Arthur. As one, 400 hands rose in salute. The ship's bell began to ring. Clear, deliberate, each toll a heartbeat. Junior sailors who had walked past his humiliation 20 minutes ago now stood at rigid attention, hands to brows, eyes forward. The checkpoint crowd had become a silent congregation. Dock workers removed their hard hats. Contractors stood motionless. Someone's child asked a question and was gently shushed. Frank spoke rapidly, words tumbling over each other, voice thick with emotion Arthur couldn't quite process. You didn't just work on this ship, sir. You saved her. 1984. You identified a catastrophic engine flaw during routine maintenance. Would have killed dozens if those turbines had failed at sea. 1991. Desert Storm. You improvised repairs to the flight deck catapults using spare parts and welding wire when we were 300 miles from the nearest support ship. Kept air missions flying for 6 straight days. 2003, your final deployment, you dove into a burning hangar and dragged out 2 injured sailors. 3rd-degree burns on your arms. You never even filed a report. Arthur stared at the ship. Tears ran freely down his face now, no shame left in them. You trained 3 generations of mechanics, Frank continued. Pilots called you the Guardian. Officers called you the old man who never sleeps. You never sought a medal, never gave an interview. You just did the work. The parking lot had filled. Families, veterans, people drawn by something they couldn't name but recognized instantly. Derek and Phil stood at the edge, faces drained of color, hands limp at their sides. Captain Rodriguez appeared at the top of the gangway. She descended deliberately, each step measured, and stopped 3 feet from Arthur. She saluted. Permission to come aboard, Chief Hayes. We can't have this ceremony without you. Arthur's voice broke into pieces. I was never a chief, just a mechanic. She smiled through her own tears. Today you're whatever you want to be. Please come home. Arthur boarded the USS Constellation flanked by an honor guard that moved like they were escorting royalty. The ceremony transformed around him. What had been planned as a standard decommissioning became something else entirely. A homecoming for a man who had never left. Sailors lined up to shake his hand, young faces bright with something between awe and disbelief. They asked for photographs. They shared stories their mentors had told them about the legendary mechanic who could fix anything with wire and willpower. Captain Rodriguez presented him with a shadow box during the formal remarks. Inside, his original tools carefully preserved, photographs of aircraft he'd kept flying, and a Navy commendation medal, the ribbon still crisp, never worn. Approved in 2004, she explained quietly, but Navy records lost track of you after retirement. It's been waiting 21 years. Arthur held the box like it might dissolve. When they asked him to speak, he approached the podium slowly, setting the shadow box down with care. "I just did my job," he said, voice steady now. "You all do the same every day," but then he paused, looked out at 400 faces watching him. Young sailors who didn't know his name an hour ago, old chiefs who remembered, the ship herself silent and waiting, his voice strengthened. "This ship was my life. You were my family. I never needed recognition. I just needed purpose." He swallowed hard. "Thank you for letting an old man say goodbye." The applause rolled across the deck like thunder. As the crowd dispersed, Arthur walked deliberately toward two figures standing isolated at the edge of the gathering. Derek and Phil. Faces hollow with shame, bodies rigid with humiliation. The crowd noticed. Conversation stopped. People watched. Arthur extended his hand. "You were doing your job, keeping the ship safe. That's what matters." Derek stared at the offered hand like he didn't deserve to touch it. When he finally did, his voice broke. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Arthur interrupted gently. "You know now. Next time, listen before you judge. Everyone has a story." Phil nodded, unable to speak. Arthur turned back to the Constellation one final time. He placed his palm against the hull, fingers spread, and whispered something only the ship could hear. Frank approached quietly. "Sir, the Navy would be honored if you'd attend more ceremonies. Speak to sailors. Your story matters." Arthur smiled, tired but genuine. "Maybe, if these old bones hold up." Arthur drove away as sunset painted Naval Station Norfolk gold. Behind him, the USS Constellation sat silent against the horizon, flags lowered in decommissioning, a giant saying its own goodbye. His story isn't unique. It's universal. Arthur Hayes represents thousands of invisible heroes who keep the world running while others take the spotlight. Mechanics who fix the planes, cooks who feed the crews, clerks who process the paperwork, drivers who deliver the supplies. They don't wear medals on their chests or give speeches at ceremonies. They show up. They do the work. They go home. His story reminds us that dignity isn't about rank or recognition. It's about character, sacrifice, and quiet service. Disrespect costs nothing to avoid. Listening costs nothing at all. The most powerful people aren't always the loudest. Sometimes they're the ones kneeling on concrete, gathering scattered photographs, just trying to say goodbye. Arthur's truck disappeared down the road, toolbox in the bed catching the last light. The metal glinted once like a signal, then faded into the distance. To every silent guardian who never asked for thanks, we see you. If this story moved you, honor those who serve in silence by sharing it. Subscribe to hear more stories of quiet heroes who changed the world without asking for anything in return. Their stories deserve to be told.